It is June 3rd, 1944. General Dwight D. Eisenhower stares out the window of Southwick House, his face a mask of calculated exhaustion as the English Channel churns with the violent winds of an unseasonable Atlantic depression. With over 150,000 men and 7,000 ships combat-loaded and waiting, the Supreme Allied Commander faces a binary choice that could determine the fate of Western civilization. Launch an amphibious invasion into a gale or risk the total collapse of the invasion's strategic surprise. How does a leader navigate the threshold between military necessity and catastrophic failure when the very atmosphere seems to conspire against him? The pressure on Eisenhower was not merely meteorological, it was structural, a consequence of the complex machinery of Operation Overlord. Allied planners had determined that a successful landing required a rare convergence of three factors: a late rising full moon for airborne navigation, low tide at dawn to expose German beach obstacles, and favorable weather for naval and air support. These constraints dictated a narrow window: June 5th, 6th, or 7th. Postponing beyond these days meant waiting until the next lunar tidal alignment on June 18th to 20th, a delay that threatened to leak the secrets of the invasion and render the massive deception of Operation Fortitude entirely obsolete. In the center of the storm was Group Captain James Martin Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorological advisor. Stagg occupied an unenviable position, tasked with synthesizing the conflicting forecasts of two distinct scientific camps. The British teams at Dunstable and the Admiralty relied on dynamic synoptic analysis, tracking the physical deformation of pressure systems across the North Atlantic, while the American team at Wide Wing under Lieutenant Colonel Irving P. Crick championed an analog method, relying on historical precedents to project weather patterns. On the morning of June 3rd, these teams stood in stark disagreement. Crick's model, viewing the atmosphere through the lens of long-term cycles, was aggressively optimistic, projecting a ridge of high pressure that would shield the channel. Stagg, however, sided with the British synoptic analysis. He watched the isobar gradients on his charts tighten, signaling a deep low-pressure system designated L5 that was advancing toward Scotland with gale force potential. He warned Eisenhower that launching on June 5th would court disaster, exposing the vulnerable landing craft to Beaufort Force 6 winds and heavy seas. Eisenhower, haunted by the recent memories of the Exercise Tiger rehearsal, chose to postpone the June 5th launch by 24 hours. The air in Southwick House grew thick with the tension of command friction. Commanders were beginning to question whether their weather experts were paralyzed by caution. To understand why Eisenhower was so brittle, one must look back only 5 weeks to the blood-soaked sands of Slapton Sands in Devon. Exercise Tiger was designed to simulate the invasion of Utah Beach, but the simulation descended into a theater of horrors. Through a series of catastrophic coordination failures, including mismatched radio frequencies and uncoordinated live-fire naval bombardment, the exercise claimed the lives of nearly 110 American soldiers by friendly fire. The command failures at Slapton Sands were a stark foreshadowing of the volatility inherent in large-scale amphibious warfare. The tragedy of Exercise Tiger deepened in the early hours of April 28th in Lime Bay. A convoy of 8 LSTs, landing ship tanks, was intercepted by German E-boats, fast, agile torpedo craft from the 5th and 9th Schnellbootflottille. Because of a simple, fatal typographical error in the operational orders, the Royal Navy escorts and the American LSTs were operating on different radio frequencies. The escort vessel, HMS Azalea, received the warning of German presence but failed to relay it to the American convoy, assuming they were already aware. The result was an unmitigated slaughter in the dark. The loss of life was staggering, with at least 749 Americans killed in the E-boat attack alone. Yet the immediate strategic concern for Eisenhower was the bigot security protocols. 10 officers who possessed the exact classified plans for the Normandy landings, including the specific assignments for Utah and Omaha beaches, were lost at sea. Eisenhower ordered a total security blackout and mobilized recovery teams to find every one of those 10 bodies. The success of the entire invasion hung on the silent, cold reality that those men remained undiscovered by German intelligence. This obsession with security and the fear of a minor error collapsing a major operation defined Eisenhower's mindset during the June weather crisis. He knew better than anyone that modern war was not just about the clash of divisions, it was about the management of friction. By June 4th, the tension reached a boiling point. At 4:45 a.m., the skies over Portsmouth were clear and calm, leading some commanders to wonder if Stagg had been too pessimistic. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory remained deeply cautious, warning that low cloud ceilings would blind Allied bombers, while Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay warned that 6-foot waves would swamp the landing craft and incapacitate the infantry before they even reached the sand. Eisenhower was caught between his commander's professional anxieties and the inexorable march of the calendar. If he delayed, the risks of detection and psychological burnout among the troops were not merely theoretical, they were probable. If he proceeded, he risked an amphibious catastrophe that would dwarf the losses of the Dieppe raid. The primary source records of Eisenhower's pre-invasion diary and Captain Harry C. Butcher's logs reveal a leader who was not undecided, but rather one who was methodically force-ranking the catastrophic outcomes. By the afternoon of June 4th, the calm weather vanished. A heavy storm hit the Southwick House headquarters, vindicating Stagg's short-term warning and proving that the clear weather of the morning was merely a temporary deception. The storm lashed the coast, and the gale-force winds projected for June 5th confirmed that a landing on that date was impossible. Eisenhower officially postponed the invasion again. The commanders were now staring down the barrel of a multi-week delay, and the strain on the inter-service relationship was visible. The internal friction was compounded by the fact that the German military meteorologists were not as blind as history often suggests. Records show that starting in March 1944, German forces had twice daily intercepted and decoded Allied weather analyses, allowing them to construct their own synoptic maps of the North Atlantic. They saw the same storms the Allies did, but their strategic misjudgment was fatal. They concluded that no sane commander would risk an amphibious landing under such marginal, hazardous conditions. The Germans had prepared for an invasion during good weather, and their lowered defensive readiness on June 6 would become the Allies' greatest, albeit unintended, strategic asset. As the storm raged on June 5th, the pressure on Eisenhower shifted toward a singular final decision. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery continued to push for an aggressive posture, arguing that the momentum of the concentrated assault forces was the primary variable that could not be sacrificed. Montgomery was willing to accept the meteorological risk, provided the Navy could manage the landing. Admiral Ramsay, meanwhile, remained the voice of cold technical reality, warning of the insurmountable danger to the landing craft. Stagg returned to the conference room with a new, tentative forecast. He identified a narrow weather window opening on June 6th. Winds were projected to drop to force 3 to 4, and while the cloud cover would remain overcast, the base would lift to 2,000 feet, marginally enough for air support. It was not the ideal scenario any commander would dream of. It was, as Eisenhower would later characterize it, the best of a bad bargain. He was now forced to synthesize these conflicting technical assessments into a single, actionable command. Eisenhower's reliance on Stagg was a masterclass in insulating command from technical paralysis. By establishing Stagg as the sole meteorological rapporteur, Eisenhower prevented his commanders from descending into a cacophony of conflicting data, forcing them to confront a singular, weighted assessment. Yet even with this structure, the burden of the decision remained his alone. If he went, he faced the elements. If he stayed, he faced the inevitable obsolescence of the most complex military operation in history. The clock was ticking. In the early hours of June 5th, with the wind still howling against the windows, Eisenhower stood before his subordinates. The forecast of a temporary lull, based on real-time empirical observations from stations like Blacksod Point, sat on the table as the only empirical evidence supporting a go order. He had to decide whether to trust the synoptic science over the lingering fears of Exercise Tiger and the dissenting views of his own air and naval commanders. The silence in the Southwick House conference room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the panes, a constant, taunting reminder of the meteorological abyss into which the Allied forces were about to plunge. Eisenhower paced the room, his jaw set, weighing the logistical nightmare of a full-scale stand-down against the tactical gamble of a landing in marginal weather. The decision to go was no longer a matter of scientific certainty. It had become an act of profound strategic intuition, a calculated risk that required him to override the very men whose job it was to ensure his safety. He looked at the faces of his commanders, Ramsay, Leigh-Mallory, and Montgomery, each representing a different facet of the invasion's operational risk. The go order for June 6th was the culmination of a brutal learning process that had begun in many ways with the failure of Exercise Tiger. Eisenhower realized that if he delayed now, the next possible window would force the fleet into the English Channel during the most severe summer storm in 20 years, an environmental trap that would have decimated the Allied Armada before a single boot touched French soil. The lesson was clear. Perfection in war is a phantom, and a commander's true duty is to select the most manageable set of risks. He authorized the launch, effectively ending the period of deliberation and committing the lives of hundreds of thousands to the unpredictability of the channel. As the order filtered down through the chain of command, the psychological shift among the Allied troops was immediate. For months, these men had been confined to sausage machine camps, their morale oscillating between the adrenaline of the mission and the soul-crushing weight of the training regimen. The release of the go order transformed that static pressure into kinetic energy. They were no longer waiting for the war, they were moving to meet it. The logistics of the operation were monumental, involving the coordination of over 7,000 vessels, from the massive capital ships of the Royal Navy to the fragile, specialized landing craft that had been Ramsay's primary concern. The German command, meanwhile, remained trapped in their own strategic miscalculation. Despite possessing the capability to intercept and decode Allied communications, they could not bridge the gap between information and understanding. They had the data, the same synoptic maps that Stagg and the British team were using, but they viewed it through the rigid lens of their own expectations, convinced that the Allies would wait for a period of absolute calm. This arrogance was the ultimate consequence of their inability to replicate the Allied command's willingness to operate within the marginal feasibility of a storm. For the Allied airborne units, the reality of the landing was far grimmer than the theoretical planners had envisioned. The low cloud ceilings, which had been the subject of such heated debate between Leigh-Mallory and his staff, forced pilots to fly at dangerously low altitudes to maintain visual contact with the dropping zones. The weather window on June 6th was, in truth, a narrow, localized lull within the larger dying storm, and it required every ounce of pilot skill to navigate the turbulence. The airborne troops, tasked with securing the flanks of the beachhead, dropped into a night of chaos, their navigation hampered by the very atmospheric conditions Stagg had struggled to predict. The landing at Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, was not the clean, synchronized sequence envisioned in the planning rooms. It was a messy, fragmented struggle that unfolded in the choppy, force-4 winds that Stagg's synoptic model had accurately, if not perfectly, anticipated. The landing craft tossed violently in the surf, testing the structural limits of the vessels and the physical limits of the men within them. Many soldiers, still recovering from the trauma of the training exercises and the knowledge of the Exercise Tiger tragedy, faced their first combat under conditions that would have been deemed unmanageable only weeks prior. Despite the environmental volatility, the Allied forces managed to establish a toehold on the French coast, proving that Eisenhower's calculated risk had been justified by the strategic necessity of the moment. The E-boats, which had been so devastating during Exercise Tiger, were kept largely in check by the intensified Allied air offensive on the S-boat pens at Cherbourg, a direct tactical response to the lessons learned from the earlier disaster. This structural improvement in security and coordination was the quiet, effective result of Eisenhower's post-Tiger reforms. As the day progressed, the reality of the German defensive failure became apparent. The weather window had acted as a shroud, shielding the Allied fleet from detection until it was too late for the German coastal batteries to organize an effective response. The strategic surprise, which the High Command had been so desperate to protect, was maintained through a combination of the deception operations and the very bad weather that the German commanders had dismissed. The irony was total. The weather they had feared was the weather that ultimately saved them. The resolution of the meteorological crisis did not bring an end to the command friction, but it did change its nature. Once the beachhead was secured, the conflict transitioned from a debate over environmental uncertainty to a battle over strategic tempo. Montgomery and his American counterparts would spend the following months debating the pace of the breakout, each driven by their own interpretation of the lessons learned during the initial, chaotic hours of the landing. The friction was no longer in the weather. It was now deeply embedded in the politics of command. Historians today view the D-Day decision as a pivotal moment in modern leadership. a case study in how to synthesize disparate, contradictory data into a single high-stakes trajectory. Crick's analog method, while mathematically flawed, did correctly signal a qualitative shift in atmospheric circulation, a nuance that modern computer reanalysis models have since validated even as they confirm the operational wisdom of Stagg's synoptic approach. Both methods had been tools. The brilliance was in the commander who knew how to use them without becoming their slave. The shadow of the missing 10 bigot officers, those who had carried the secrets of the invasion to the grave at Slapton Sands, remained a permanent part of the Overlord legacy. Their sacrifice ensured that the German command remained in the dark, a silent contribution to the success of the landing that never made the headlines. Eisenhower's obsession with their recovery was not just a matter of protocol. It was a realization that in an operation of this magnitude, the smallest detail, a single radio frequency, a misplaced officer, a weather report, could unravel everything. When looking back at the decision to launch on June 6th, we must ask if the outcome was truly inevitable. If Eisenhower had chosen to wait, would the storm have broken, or would the fleet have been shredded in the channel? The documented evidence suggests that he chose the least catastrophic path among a set of equally dangerous alternatives. This is the essence of command friction. The commander is always maneuvering in a space where no perfect information exists, and where every decision creates a new, unforeseen set of constraints. The resolution of the Stag versus the Generals conflict left a lasting mark on Allied operational methodology. It led to the standardization of joint service communication protocols and a far deeper integration of scientific intelligence into the highest levels of command decision-making. The war would continue for another year, but the operational model established in that room at Southwick House had become the blueprint for Allied success. A reliance on data, a tolerance for managed risk, and an unyielding commitment to operational tempo. Ultimately, the story of the D-Day weather forecast is a story of how humanity struggles to impose order on a chaotic, indifferent natural world. It serves as a reminder that even at the height of modern technological capability, the most crucial decisions are often those that force us to accept our limitations. Eisenhower did not win the day because he could predict the future. He won because he could survive the uncertainty of the present. As we look at the legacy of those few days in June 1944, we see not just the victory of an invasion, but the victory of a command culture that could adapt, learn, and persist. The friction that had threatened to tear the headquarters apart was the same friction that ensured that no single commander, no single scientific model, and no single risk could jeopardize the mission. It was a triumph of the Allied system, a system that, for all its flaws, understood that the ultimate weapon in war is the ability to make a decision when everything else is in doubt. If you were in Eisenhower's position at Southwick House, knowing that a delay could compromise the entire invasion, but launching meant risking a catastrophe similar to Exercise Tiger, would you have ordered the launch on June 6th? Share your thoughts on the balance between strategic risk and environmental certainty in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.